You're Locked On Coyotes, your daily podcast on the Arizona Coyotes, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome in, everybody. This is Dane Lewis, host of the Locked On Dallas Stars podcast, joined now by both hosts of the Locked On Arizona Coyotes podcast, Robyn and Carl Pavlock. Guys, hockey season is almost here, and I know it's been a fairly busy offseason with Coyotes, at least as far as drafting goes. Some pretty big names to talk about, which we'll touch on here in a second. But how are you guys feeling? How excited are y'all to have hockey back soon in our lives here just this month in September?
You know, I think in the general sense, I'm glad to have hockey back because, I feel like there's nothing to do without hockey. But at the same time, and I think Carl can help, back me up on this, we're covering a team that's just not going to be good. So it's just going to be it's going to be just dread, just freaking endless dread.
It's year 2 of the rebuild. It's my second year rebuild, covering the Coyotes, because there was the other one back in 2015. I know exactly what to look forward to, and it's not the most fun thing, but it's exciting. Being able to watch hockey is fun, even if I'm not going to like most of the results.
Yeah, I certainly can understand that angle, and maybe it's a grind to get through this season for Coyotes fans, but perhaps if you get that elusive number 1 pick, maybe you get a franchise altering player out of that pick, or at least maybe a pick in the top 3. But I want to look back at this most recent draft that took place over the summer and kind of get you guys' thoughts on some of the picks that your team acquired, mainly the first round pick, or at least the first pick that you guys had in the first round in Logan Cooley. Were you surprised that Shane Wright was on the board? And was it kind of expected that Cooley was the guy, regardless of who was going to be there? What were your overall thoughts on that selection with Logan Cooley on the first night of the draft?
So, I was half surprised to see Shane Wright fall. I think there was that subtle expectations, I think with how everything has been going, it wouldn't 100% shock us, but at the same time, it's it's Shane Wright. He's supposed to be great. When he failed, it was between him and Cooley at number 3. We're just it makes sense to take Cooley because of the way it fits the system. And then obviously later on we found out it's okay, now it makes even more sense because Cooley wants to be here in Arizona versus apparently from what we've been told that if Shane Wright were drafted by Arizona, he would not want to play for them. So that is, what has also made sense on that side. So Cooley was definitely the best pick though. Obviously it's still way too early because we haven't seen him hit the ice officially as an Arizona Coyote, but from what we're all gathering, he's gonna be a freaking rock star.
Yeah, I've actually gotten a chance to see Cooley play at a prospect scrimmage, and it was really fun. I fell in love with watching the guy play, and it was definitely a surprise. There had been rumblings that Slafkovsky was going to go number 1, and New Jersey just didn't want Wright from everything that had been said. So it felt going into it, there was maybe a 1 in 10 chance. I didn't know that, how much Cooley wanted to play in Arizona. If I had known that, then I would have been higher on him the day of, because that definitely makes a difference. They want buy-in with the rebuild, and Cooley's timeline just fits the rebuild.
Yeah, for sure. And, it seems from everything I could gather that pretty much everyone around that Coyotes organization seems pretty pleased with that pick as well as, some of the other picks in the draft. I know Arizona had, I believe, 3 in the first round. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Who are some other, key players that you really, were high on when the Coyotes picked them, whether it was still in the first round or maybe later on in the draft?
So obviously, you kind of had to go through the draft. We can't go through talking about the draft without talking about Conor Mcgeeki, because the Coyotes drafted. They traded up to get him, like pretty significantly to get him. I'm still questioning whether it was worth trading up that far to get him. But he's still a high name on the on the draft board. Like some experts had him in the top 10, and the Coyotes got him at 11, right, Carl? I think it's 11. So,
yep, 11.
It's like, okay, that kind of makes sense. When you look at some of his flaws, it's like, okay, we'll see how that works out. But I'm looking forward to see what he can do because, he can, he's another center, but can probably slot over to the wing if we really need to. And he's got size. I think everyone, if you look at down the roster, with the exception of Logan Cooley, everybody on the Coyotes drafted are freaking big people.
Yeah, everyone's over like I think 6'1", but Cooley. There's a lot to kind of like. One of the players that really stood out, just because I just kind of wrote about him, 36 overall, Duda, Russian defenseman, looked phenomenal. I did a ranking of him on 5 for Howling, and as soon as I started looking deeper into him, I'm like, we put him way too low. This guy is just impressive. Split time between the KHL and the MHL this past year, and should be pretty interesting.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's a lot to be looking forward to in Arizona as far as these young players, especially with the size, just with how big some players get in the NHL these days with speed, size, strength. It looks like the Coyotes certainly going after players that seem to cover all those bases. You say Cooley may be a little undersized, but still an incredibly talented player. But kind of shifting the focus to the main current NHL roster guys that we're going to see play for the Coyotes this season, starting with a guy that's been in some rumors over the past several weeks, really throughout the offseason, and Jacob Chikron. What are your guys' thoughts on him? Do you think that he stays with the team? Do you think, the Coyotes look to deal him, or do you think there's another team that is, interested in him that you could see him going to? What are your overall thoughts on him and his current situation with the team?
Yeah, so we Carl and I actually had this discussion earlier this week on the Locked On Coyotes podcast, and there is a lot of question behind that on what's going to happen. I think there is a general consensus that if we see Jacob Chikron hit the ice come training camp, he will not get traded until at least the trade deadline. But obviously, and maybe even doesn't happen, because the thing is, we've seen so many rumor mills go up, and it's an endless cycle for Coyotes players in general. Like any player who's playing above or is a high value player, it's like, oh, when are the Coyotes going to trade this player? They obviously can't have him. But it'll be interesting to see. We'll definitely be watching it. But like I said, that if he hits the ice this training camp, he probably won't be dealt for a while.
Yep, same. Like Robyn said, we just had an episode about that. Those are pretty much all my thoughts too.
Yeah, for sure. I figure, I can only do so much digging on the internet with, some sources that may or may not be, very credible. But I know you guys are going to know a lot more than I will about the whereabouts of players that could be on the move, especially out of Arizona. And, we talk about players that departed from the team this offseason. I know not too long ago we saw Phil Kessel go to Vegas. Was that a move? I mean, I think it was expected that he would go somewhere else. Is he a guy that you think will be missed heavily in Arizona, or do you think it's just kind of a meh situation? Because I know, if a team's in a rebuild, sometimes you get attached to some players that, were longtime veterans or just good personalities. What were kind of you guys' thoughts as Phil Kessel goes on to Las Vegas?
Carl, go.
So I think as soon as I heard that Rick Tocchet lived in Las Vegas, I was like, oh, that's exactly why. I should have called that immediately if I had known. Kessel was a player that we all kind of expected to be traded at the deadline last year. So him walking away definitely didn't, really impact that much. We had already kind of had our goodbye, and he ended up staying. It does seem like he wants to go to a team that can compete. I don't know if Vegas has the goaltending to be a competitor, but it's where he wanted to go. And, all the power in the world to him. I hope he has a great end to his career. I think no one in Arizona is going to say too much bad about him, just normal Kessel criticisms. But I think he can still contribute. One of the things that I really liked watching him do is play with Lawson Krause. He can't really get the shot off as much, but he could find a streaking forward and get it into the net. It's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, Phil Kessel was he was the definition of like a true teammate. He definitely was a leader on the ice. He made a really big impact for the Coyotes, and in many ways more than just on the ice. You can tell the kind of person he was. And again, of course, on the ice, he was great too. I think this last year was a little bit of a falter. Obviously, he had a lot of assists, but he didn't get as many goals as we're used to seeing. But that's also him choosing to kind of take that more leader role and kind of helping set things up. Because we saw freaking unbelievable amount of assists from him. So he can slot in any role, and I think he will do well. And I think even at his age, he just will continue to contribute. And we're looking for. We're glad to see him over in Vegas. It's not too far, but yeah,
for sure. And I'm curious to see. You just mentioned him being the ultimate teammate. One day when this Arizona franchise kind of takes that next step and they're competing in the postseason yet again. These younger guys on the team, your Clayton Kellers of the world. How many of them will say, I remember, back in the rebuild days, having a teammate like Phil Kessel, encouraging me or being a mentor type figure for a guy that's been around in this league for a long time. I say all the time, you can't really ever have too much veteran leadership on your team as far as, kind of teaching the younger players how to be a professional on and off the ice. And it seems like Phil Kessel, for the most part, did that pretty well in Arizona and hopefully can do that in Vegas as well. I know they have quite the cast of characters over there. And kind of the last question I want to run by you guys, kind of going back to the younger crowd on the team with draft picks and things of that nature. Who are some guys that could be seeing, some quality NHL minutes this season for the Coyotes that might not be on many other NHL fans' radars, or especially in the Central Division? Because I feel like, you can have these teams like this where you just see, a full line or, 3 or 4 different players. You say, I've never heard of this kid, but, they're putting up some really impressive numbers, or, they skate really well. They shoot the puck well. Who are some of those guys, or maybe 1 or 2 guys, that each of you have in mind?
So a lot of the young guys are probably not going to show up because, we advocate for don't rush our prospects and make sure they develop. So I would love to say Dylan Genther, but he's not going to show up. Just let him furry. But I will say, and one player who I think who would probably likely make a few appearances and make some decent minutes, and it's JJ Moser. He was a second round draft pick in the 2021 draft as an overager, and he came in and instantly made an impact. He looked really good in Tucson and became a impact defenseman once he got called up, when literally 90% of the defense was gone through injury for the Coyotes, and he made and that impact was felt, and because of that, don't be surprised to see more of him in this next year.
Do you have another one?
Oh, another one.
Oh.
Probably not going to won't show up as much, but obviously I will see what he does in Tucson as well. But Matthias Michelle is another one. I think he'll probably get another guy to get called up, and that dude is so fun to watch. Obviously when I was living in Tucson, I was watching him all the time. Oh my god, please give me more Matthias Michelle.
I knew you were going to do Michele. So the 2 that I'm going to do, the other kind of younger player, Michael Carcone, who is also played a couple of games with the team last year, did really good with the Tucson Roadrunners. Really looking forward to see what he can do for a full season. A lot of people may have forgotten that the Coyotes have Connor Timmons because he went down almost immediately with a knee injury last season. And he should hopefully be back, knock on wood. I don't know if he's going to start. I haven't really heard much update on him. I think Craig Morgan tweeted out that he's rehabbing, but I would need to check on that. But I definitely think he is a player who could make an impact once he's healthy.
Yeah, definitely. And, if you're a Stars fan listening, keep an eye out for those names if we, have the Coyotes up on the schedule. Because I know even last year. I know Scott Wedgwood was a guy that had been around the league for quite some time, an older player, but a guy I wasn't super familiar with. He had a knack for shutting down the Stars, and now he is a member of the Dallas Stars. So you never know when or where a quality player will turn up, whether they're playing against your team or for your team. But to flip the script here a little bit, I want to open up the floor to you guys to ask any Stars related questions you might have. I know we'll have a good handful of Coyotes fans listening to this as well. So I want to open up the floor for you guys and your listeners.
So, yeah. Since you brought up kind of Wedgwood, I'm curious, what was his role kind of with Dallas at the end of the year, and what do you anticipate it being to start out?
Yeah, I think his role at the end of the year and the role going into this season will be very similar in that, the Stars last year at the beginning of training camp, beginning of the season, had this rotation of veteran goalies that were kind of supposed to, be present on the team throughout the season, with Braden Holtby and Anton Hudobin starting in net, and Ben Bishop's supposed to come back from injury. But by the end of the season, all three of those guys either were retired or on the IR and could not play. So Jake Ottinger steps up to be the number one. And then the Stars go out and get Wedgwood at the deadline to be, a good quality backup. And that's exactly what he was. He played on a lot of nights that Jake Ottinger just needed a breather because, I think Rick Bowness and the coaching staff knew that Jake was going to, if the Stars did make the playoffs, that they were going to need his very best and that he was going to need to be in the best shape possible. And so there were a good handful of games that Scott Wedgwood had to come in and play some high-quality opponents. His first start was on the road in Carolina, and I believe he had 40-plus saves that night in a Stars overtime win. He played against the Toronto Maple Leafs at one point in the season and fought really hard, and the only reason that he lost is because Austin Matthews did Austin Matthews things in overtime and scored a game winner. So Scott Wedgwood has, certainly been a welcome surprise here in Dallas. I don't think many people were expecting a goalie trade at the start of last season, but there was a need for it, and they go out and get Wedgwood, and now they've signed him to a pretty team-friendly deal. I believe it's only, I have cap friendly pulled up here, 2 seasons, $1 million a season. So certainly not breaking the bank for a pretty quality backup goaltender.
Yeah, that's great to hear, especially for a player who's been claimed off of waivers twice by the Coyotes.
Yeah, that pretty much. And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because a lot of that sounded pretty familiar to us, because like a lot of Coyotes fans will be familiar with the way he kind of helped Karel Vejmelka during those times when like, Vejmelka just needed a breather. Wedgwood was that guy, and just to hear that he continued that kind of role with Dallas is nice to hear. I mean, I think a lot of us have somewhat, like, here in Arizona, have so much respect for Wedgwood for his 2 stints with the Arizona Coyotes.
Yeah, came in twice to break up a freaking 12 NHL record 12-game losing streak to start
the season.
What a stat.
It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. A couple things I'd like to know is because kind of like in a similar way that you asked us, who are some players that might be coming out to make a new appearance for the Dallas Stars who, might make an impact right away for them, and that, that Coyotes fans might be interested in keeping an eye on.
For sure. There's certainly a good handful of players, and the first one I'll start with is a defenseman. The first round pick for the Dallas Stars back in the 2019 draft, his name is Thomas Harley, and he's played some minutes at the NHL level already. Not a ton. His sample size is pretty small, and even, as far as games, but also just time on ice, typically being on that bottom defensive pairing if he was playing at all. But he's a guy that, has a lot of upside. And I think this new coaching staff led by Pete DeBoer, they really like him. And I know the rest of the team is pretty high on him as well. And there's going to be plenty of, high expectations for him to, take a really big step in his professional career, especially with the absence of John Klingberg, who's now in Anaheim. It's kind of the Miro Heiskanen show on defense, but there's this expectation that this young Thomas Harley kid is going to, finally take the steps forward to be a full-time NHLer, not a guy who's playing at the AHL, but a guy who's going to be with the NHL club on a nightly basis. And, he can score, but he can also play the defensive side pretty well. And I'm excited to see him. And then I think he's a lock to make the roster just because of the need for defensive depth. But you even look at the forward position, and there's kind of some might call it a 3-way race, but I think we could very well see two of these guys maybe crack the opening night roster, guys that have been dominating the Canadian Hockey League, and Wyatt Johnston, Logan Stankoven, and Maverick Bork, who Maverick Bork was picked back in 2020, and then Stankoven and Johnston both picked in the first 2 rounds of the 2021 draft. And I mean, there's just not enough time to completely talk about how great these guys are. Johnston, I think led the entire OHL in points at 124 and like 68 games played. Stankoven been standout for his team in Kamloops with the Blazers, but also been a standout on Team Canada and junior competition. So I expect all 3 of those guys to come in and put on a show in training camp and try to fight for a roster spot in what's turned into a pretty crowded forward room in Dallas. I think the top 6 are probably pretty set in stone, but I think maybe even that third line, but there's going to be a fourth line where I think there's going to be some spots open, and I would expect Johnston, Stankoven, and Bork to all be fighting pretty hard to try to claim one of those roster spots.
Yeah, I also
was that kind of
player. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was gonna say I also see some player names that I do kind of recognize that obviously aren't the superstars. And maybe it's just me, but some of these players, maybe you might know about this too, but if I'm not mistaken, for some of the lifetime AHLers maybe spend a lot of time with the Texas Stars or whatever that are finally making their appearance up with Dallas. Because I'm like, wait a minute, these sound so familiar. I'm looking at I think Joel Hanley's up there and Luke Glendinning. I'm like, wait a minute, I recognize these players. Where do I recognize them from?
So both those guys, especially Luke Glendinning, I think Luke Glendinning might have played all 82 games last season, but he was usually on the Stars' third or fourth line, kind of the checking center, one of the better defensive forwards on the team. And then Joel Hanley was kind of in that bottom 6 rotation on defense as well, sometimes being the 7th man or the odd man out of the defensive pairings. So I wouldn't expect them to be at the AHL level, but you never know if they need, an injury recovery throughout the season, but they're definitely guys that, have been around the league for a little bit, but certainly not the guys you think of when you think Dallas Stars hockey.
So does it seem like the expectations going into this offseason were you guys were going to get the promotions from the juniors players? And how does that kind of impact what your expectations for the season are as a whole?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been the expectation that at least one of those guys I mentioned is going to crack the roster. And there's a handful of other guys that have been playing with the Texas Stars as well that I think have a shot, like Ty Dellandrea, Riley Tufte, just to name a couple. I think there's, certainly some excitement around them, but there's also plenty of excitement still with the NHL veterans on this team. I mean, we're coming off a season where Joe Pavelski is, 37, 38 years old, putting up the best stat line of his career. Playing alongside, Jason Robertson, who just scored 40 goals in his, sophomore campaign, who is still at the time of recording this unsigned, but as long as the rest of every single Stars fan is hopeful that he will get signed before training camp to a new deal. And then, of course, Rope Hintz is a guy worth getting excited about as well. So the offseason had a mixture of excitement for the future, but also looking to kind of build around those guys. And the cap situation wasn't too great for the Stars for this offseason, due in large part to paying Jamie Benn and Tyler Say around a quarter of the cap. But they did make some nice additions. Mason Marchment comes over from the Florida Panthers. He had a great season playing kind of in the middle 6 with them, and I think that's going to be the expectation in Dallas as well. And they even add some defensive depth with a guy like Colin Miller from Buffalo. Not a huge standout, big name that a lot of people recognize, but when you lose a guy like John Klingberg, who's been such a key component to this team for so many years, you've got to try to add that defensive depth and give Miro Heiskanen some support.
So you mentioned Joe Pavelski, and I'm looking at his cap friendly. Is he in the final year of a 3-year contract, or is his 3-year contract, or is that just an extra $5.5 million you decided to give him for another year?
So he signed a new deal like February or March of last season, just a 1-year extension. So this is a 1-year extension worth $5.5 million.
Okay, because I was trying to do all the math in my head. Like it's
yeah.
I am surprised that Joe Pavelski is playing some of his best hockey right now. But that's cool. Always love it when an old guy does well.
By the way.
Yeah, it's also exciting. I've talked about this with several other hosts as well, doing these season previews. That he's reuniting with his old coach and Pete DeBoer from San Jose, and at least from a storyline perspective, there's a lot of good potential. Like, oh, this would be cool if both those guys still have yet to win a Stanley Cup, and it seems like Pavelski very well could be on his way out of the league. As sad as that is to think about, but certainly there are better teams on paper to win the Stanley Cup or at least win the Western Conference this season. But the Stars, I think, have a shot to be competitive. And, just selfishly in my mind, would love to have the storyline of, old coach, old captain of said coach reuniting for one last ride. But we'll have to see what happens.
I mean, that is a good story. It's a very good story. Unfortunately, that's probably why it's never going to happen. Like, the good stories never happen.
Right. If it's too good to be true, that it usually is. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, if you guys don't have any other questions about the Stars, we can kind of transition into some discussion about the division as a whole. Because I know, it seems like we, or maybe I'll agree with this. I imagine y'all do, but if you don't, let me know that the number one spot seems to be a lock, and I would say maybe the 7th and 8th spot of the division seem to be a lock as well. But the rest of the division kind of seems to be up for grabs. How do you guys see things shaping out from your perspective, covering a team like the Coyotes?
Yeah, I mean, that is a pretty fair assessment. That 1, 7, and 8 is just a lot. Like, you can't get look past where Colorado, Chicago, and Arizona are going to finish, because you have the expectations are freaking clear. But to see Minnesota and what they're doing, they're kind of like, I don't know. They can be either going up or they can be going down or whatever. Dallas has been up and on, and I know that's what I have the last couple of seasons. I've never understood which Dallas team am I going to see. St. Louis is going to be the same. It's just you're right. It's just going to be such a cluster in there. I really don't know.
I'm going to be loving the Coyotes and the Blackhawks just racing to the bottom. I expect the Blackhawks to tank blatantly, and it is going to be glorious to see. Get an AHL backup in there for a game at one point, just because, and see who gets traded, because Chicago has a lot of interesting pieces, and I never thought I'd hear Patrick Kane's name being thrown around, but it seems like that's happening and could happen. So that's going to be the story we focus on, the Chicago-Arizona tank fest.
I mean, the tank hard for Bedard sweepstakes is already in full swing. So
yeah. Last season, we didn't know that Montreal was going to be doing what they do. This one, we're anticipating. It makes sense. That was just oh, wow.
Yeah, I feel like Chicago and Montreal have maybe switched places, where last year there was kind of this Chicago went and got Marc-Andre Fleury, so they're a legit team, right? And then they just were not legit, whereas Montreal was coming off a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. But now Chicago, I think in my power rankings that I did a month ago for the division, I think I personally put Chicago last, because I was like, which roster do I recognize more players on? And I recognized more Coyote names than I did Chicago names. So
I did the same thing. I also put Chicago 8 on those power rankings. I listed Chicago at 8 and Arizona at 7.
Yeah, it's they're
gonna tank hard.
It's gonna be fun to watch, just as the season winds down. You'll have, I hope the Stars are fighting for a playoff spot, but also seeing which team in the division is also going to be gunning for that number one spot, because the Central Division already pretty competitive at the top. And then, if you throw in a team like Chicago or Arizona here in the next 3-4 years, that's also going to be competitive. I mean, perhaps we'll see one of these other top teams in the division maybe fall out a little bit. It's going to make things really interesting. So,
because we were saying, because Connor Bedard is the kind of guy that can change a franchise almost overnight.
Absolutely.
And the cool thing is, obviously he's the name that's being tossed around for the 2023 draft. But if you look at the 2023 draft, it's probably going to be one of the deepest we've ever seen, one of the strongest we've ever seen. I should not say more than deep, but strongest. And that's awesome.
Yeah, I think, and I've heard other people say it. I'm certainly not the first person to have this take, but I think it's one that could be very true that at the trade deadline, we could see like you always have teams that are looking to sell, but I think you could see even more teams looking to sell at the deadline if they know they're not going to make the postseason just because, like you said, this is a draft full of, franchise-esque players, guys that can be the face of your team for, 10, 15 more seasons. And so you could have teams in every division, like San Jose. If you talk to JD at Lund Sharks, they're not looking to be very good. Anaheim, Seattle, Montreal. The list just goes on and on. I think we could see a lot of sellers and a lot of teams just absolutely loading up for deep playoff runs at the trade deadline. And I expect Colorado to be in that conversation, likely St. Louis, Minnesota, depending on where they are, Nashville, and then maybe even Dallas, just depending on how teams, roster situations work out and who's at the top of the standings and who's at the bottom.
Given how tight the cap is, think of all the shenanigans we're going to get to see leading up to that, because you're right. There could definitely be like a lot of players moving, but you're going to need to make room, and a lot of the good teams don't have the space.
Although one thing that I do look forward to, like you mentioned, the cap is next year. The cap, we're from expectation, is supposed to go up pretty significantly. So
that'll be fun.
That would maybe help Stars fans forget that we're paying Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin both over $9 million a season for them to produce like mid-six players. So who knows?
For like multiple years. It's so long.
Tyler Seguin until 2027 and Jamie Benn until 2025. Man, gotta love it. Maybe they'll have a bounce back here. Myself and many others are hopeful / almost demanding that they have nice bounce back years with a new coaching staff and maybe both of them playing alongside Mason Marchment. Maybe that's the key we've been missing all this time. But Robyn and Carl, thank you guys.
With those numbers, they could have multiple bounce back years over their careers.
Yeah, the time, especially Seguin. 2027. Who knows what life is going to look like then? Tyler Seguin could have a Jamie Benn Joe Pavelski type, renaissance at the end of the career. Or maybe Jamie Benn has that too, but Ben on the other side of 30, Seguin right at 30. So who knows, man? Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. But Robyn and Carl, thank you guys for crossing over and talking hockey with myself. And I know that the Central Division shows are fun to do with everyone just because every team is in a different spot. But I know for the Stars fans listening, if you guys want to plug your show, your social media, now is a great time to do that so they know where to find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for the Locked On Coyotes podcast, we're found everywhere you get your podcast. We also have our YouTube channel. We also are on some local news apps for those that are familiar with 12 News in Phoenix. We are on their app, their mobile app as well. On social media, we're on Facebook, facebook.com/LockedOnCoyotes, and on Twitter at LO_Coyotes. And I myself personally am at Robyn_Leano. That is Robyn with a Y _LEANO. And Carl.
Yep, I am at Carl Pavlock, FFH. I am also the managing editor of 5 for Howling. You can find that on Twitter, the word 5, the number 4, the word Howling. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Very cool. And if there's any Coyotes fans who want to keep up with the Dallas Stars, you can find Locked On Stars and on your favorite podcasting platform, as well as on YouTube, just like Locked On Coyotes. And we're sitting just under 700 subscribers right now. So if you ex-Coyotes fan feel so inclined to subscribe, I promise to be nice to the Coyotes every time we play them this season. I'll probably be nice to them anyway because they have some really fun young talent, but just throwing that out there. And then you can find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis, as well as just our show, a nice, simple at Locked On Stars. But Robyn, Carl, thank you guys for joining, and we'll have to do this again sometime soon.